Kevin's Pastor Kevin is pretty good. I really like Pastor Kevin.
Okay. This is my favorite period of church history. Well, one of my favorite. I mean, early church. I still think early church is probably my favorite period in church history. But the Reformation period that starts in Great Britain is, I think. Wow! Oh, that even hurt my ears. Thank you, Lord Jesus.
Missed it, bro.
Oh, no, I didn't.
All right, where am I hearing that? There we go. So, this is my favorite period of church history. Probably because we're kind of getting into my specialty. Let's see here. There we go. Now you can see it. We're getting into this is not my specialty. This lays the background. This lays the foundation for my specialty later on. So, if you haven't figured this out about me, I really appreciate understanding things. Like I like, if you're going to say you are something, that I'm totally cool with that. That's dope. But really know what you're saying. And so if you're going to say you're Wesleyan, then really know what that means. Because some people will call themselves Wesleyan and they don't actually know what John Wesley actually taught. And so that's what started that journey for me, was taking the Wesleyan theology class here at Southwestern. It's different than the one that you guys take in the traditional program, the adult studies class. I appreciate it. I mean, it set me on the journey that I'm on. But I think I would have much rather taken the Wesleyan theology class in the traditional program, because it dives into Wesley's theology a lot more. But as the Reformation leaves Germany, right? We've gone from Germany, we've gone down into Switzerland. Eventually, it's obviously going to spread into France, because that's where John Calvin is from. But then it's going to make its way into Great Britain. So the Reformation is spreading across Europe. And that's right. Damn it. I need to see my notes. So let me get my PowerPoint over here on this too, so I can see some of my notes. Nope. Reformation in Europe really centers around King Henry VIII. So there's a long line of English kings and queens. I mean, it's really hard to kind of track all the European kings, especially for England, the kings and queens of monarchies. And I always think of the European monarchies like I do the popes of the medieval era. There's just so many of them, and it's so confusing for me sometimes. But the one that sticks out for me in church history is definitely King Henry VIII. And the reason why that is 52. Yes, he did.
I thought he only killed one of them.
No. He either killed them or had them imprisoned. So
One of them literally.
yes. So let's see here. Man, you're gonna.
He did it like right in front of the church.
Where's it at? Yep. Dadgummit. Open. You're gonna make me do that. That is so stupid. Hey!
Jody. Good morning, Joe.
Wow. Yeah, it's not gonna do what I want it to do. That is so dumb. So the English Reformation starts with Henry VIII, and this story really kicks off because the English reformers are dealing with things different than Martin Luther and John Calvin were. Remember, the Reformation happens in different parts of the world for different reasons. Okay. And now in Germany and in Switzerland, there were similar reasons, right? The rising nationalism, things like that. But England was already a country. England had a long established monarchy by this point in the 1500s. And they had different political situations than Luther did and Calvin did. In England, in the English Reformation that's taking place, the primary issue all canon law, meaning the laws of the church. Remember, for those of us that went and studied the 20 canons of the Nicene Council. So, in order to strengthen ties, the eighth, who was lineage, was married to Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon, that was King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Now, the interesting was, Catherine was originally betrothed to be married to died, and he's got to marry, to strengthen those ties with Spain. And the prime reason for this is gas. Are you kidding me? The internet connection just went down and I was recording. Nice. Dadgummit. Okay, here we go. We'll see if this catches up to me.
Hey,
Maybe.
Michael, how about the LLC Wi-Fi now? Yeah, I know.
We'll see. Dang, I hope this records.
I have limited hotspot. Like I have unlimited data, but I have limited hotspot, so I can't use my hotspot all the time.
But I don't even try it, just use the SU speeds.
Yeah, well, I haven't, like, I don't know why, but the rooms in the back get better Wi-Fi than my room.
Okay.
Yeah, like,
All right, we'll see if that works. So I'm pulling up something here. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So here's the thing about what's going on with Catherine and Henry VIII. So an English monarch, well, pretty much any European monarchy, they are patriarchal, right? So all the inheritance, all the rights, especially the first right to be the monarch, follows the male line, not the female line, okay? So he has to have a male son, according to English law, in order to continue to carry down the Tudor family name, okay? And so he gets married, and the marriage does to Catherine, and the marriage does not produce any male heirs. It only produces Princess Mary Tudor. Okay, now this is let's see here. This is going to all kind of come to a head when he wants to get divorced. Okay, and he wants to get it annulled, and the Pope at the time, because again all marriages were done in and through the church, monarchs throughout Europe, their marriages were always overseen by a bishop, obviously, generally, because they're monarchs, and the bishops, especially the Pope, was the one that kind of worked very closely with, making sure every country had a king, more or less, or a queen, that was installed by God. This whole divine right of the kings, right? The right to rule came from God. Think Saul and David, that story. Even though God told them originally, Israel, you don't want a king, let me be your king. But the people said, no, we want a king. So he gave them Saul, right? Okay. So Henry's solution is to have the marriage annulled, but the Pope won't do it. And the reason why is because Catherine is the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. The one that got all mad and kicked Luther out of the Roman Catholic Church? That guy. The one that he was in. The Pope and Charles V are in this relationship because of Catherine, obviously, but they've already been working together because of Martin Luther. So when Luther goes to trial, he's going to trial before one of the Pope's cardinals and Charles V, okay? And so Catherine is the aunt of Charles V. And the Pope realizes, I can't annul this marriage and tick off the Spanish. I need Charles V to be happy with me. So he tells Henry VIII, no, I'm not going to annul the marriage. Now, let me kind of shift gears here, and before we get back to kind of what Henry is doing, and tell you about a guy named Thomas Cranmer. Okay, you're going to want to take notes, by the way, so for those of you that are just kind of sitting around twiddling your thumbs. Thomas Cranmer, Cranmer, and then Thomas. Now Thomas, here, I'll write his name on the board. Thomas Cranmer. Now, sir.
Can I take notes on my phone?
Yeah, that's fine. So Thomas Cranmer is born in 1489. His family is a modest family. His father had married into a very wealthy Hatfield British family, and there's a lot of kids. And Cranmer, basically the family, because there's so many kids, Thomas has to basically go work for the church in order to survive. And he can't live off of the income of the estate, of his family estate. In fact, when his dad dies on May 27th, 1501, Cranmer's older brother basically received all the inheritance, and that's why Thomas has to basically go work for the church. And so within a couple of years, Cranmer starts to study at Cambridge University, okay? And he finishes his undergraduate degree, starts a fellowship, and then he earns his master's of art, his MA degree, Master of Arts degree. And around this time, he's introduced to Erasmus, okay? So let me show you a picture. It's later on in my notes in my PowerPoint, but I'm wanting to make sure you guys see this. All right, so that's Thomas Cranmer. Now, so while he's studying and doing his graduate degree, this is when he's introduced to Erasmus and the other Christian humanists. He may even have actually attended a lecture or two under Erasmus. And so he eventually marries a young woman named Joan. And this, at the time, kind of derails some of his academic studies. While he was not yet in holy orders, the marriage cost Cranmer his Cambridge fellowship as a reader at the Buckingham College, because you had to be single, I guess, to do that. And so to survive, Cranmer takes a position at the college as a reader. His wedded bliss is not going to last, though, because his wife dies giving birth, not even a year later after getting married. So with marriage no longer a hurdle, Cambridge reoffers his fellowship to him, and he becomes a lecturer in divinity at Cambridge. And Cranmer throws himself into his studies and his teaching. And so by 1520, he becomes ordained as a priest and became one of the college preachers. For those of you that are wondering, the reason why I'm jumping into Thomas Cranmer so much is because this is something I did in my doctoral study, because it ties directly into my Wesleyan dissertation. During this time, he's lecturing at Cambridge. He's introduced to the teachings of Martin Luther, all right, to the theology of Luther while he's at Cambridge. And eventually, Cambridge bans all of Luther's works. Okay, they're like, listen, we don't want to deal with this, because at that time they're Roman Catholic, right? And so, this notwithstanding, Cranmer decides to kind of deeply examine and appreciate the scriptures themselves, and then that generates an interest into Martin Luther's works because of Martin Luther's heavy emphasis on the word. So in 1546, Cranmer finishes his doctorate in divinity, and he's placed in charge of examining divinity candidates. So basically, he's the guy who teaches their final course that you guys take here. What do we call that? Capstone course. Think of it that way. He's the professor who's in charge of examining the student and making sure that they pass their capstone course. And so in August of 1529, while he's tutoring and teaching and examining these graduates, Cranmer starts to have dinner with some of his Cambridge classmates, his former Cambridge classmates, a guy by the name of Stephen Gardiner and Edward Fox. Now, both Gardiner and Fox had earned themselves these very prestigious roles within the king's court. All right, so let's go back to Henry VIII here. Over the course of the meal, the men, Cranmer and Gardiner and Fox, start to discuss King Henry's impending divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Cranmer's, because they're trying to figure this out, because the king says, hey, listen, I don't want to be married to her anymore. She can't produce a male heir. The Pope says, sorry, no can do. You got to stay married. I'm not going to approve the annulment. And they're Roman Catholic, so they don't approve divorces all that well. And so Cranmer comes up in the conversation. He suggests, well, wait a minute. The king's marital issue is purely a theological one, and it's an issue that the Church of England, the theologians, those of us that are making up the leaders of the Church in England, we can decide this for ourselves. We don't need a pope. We don't need a bishop over another region of the world to come and decide our issues for us. We can figure this out on our own. And so Cranmer goes back to Cambridge, and he convinces a commission of his colleagues of his opinion. And he's like, listen, we can do this on our own. We don't need the Pope to do this. We have been a church in England just as long as, almost as long as the church in Rome. And I'll explain that a little bit more here in a minute. Well, in fact, let's just do it now. So in that, there's several legends throughout church history that explain that. We know, for example, that in the book of Acts, we see that Jews from across the world come to Pentecost, right? They come to the Pentecost festival. That's why everybody's on the street. They hear them speaking in tongues, right? Okay. So we know that when they go back, when the new Christians start to leaving, they go back to their parts of the world. We know that they go and they start a church in Rome, for example, right? Based off of that. But there's even some examples that some people started to take the gospel even to the West, okay? Whether that happens at the book of Acts or not, we do know that there were some of the apostles that start to take the gospel to other parts of the world that eventually lead to their martyrdom, right? John's the only one that dies of old age, and he lives out the rest of his life in Ephesus, right? So one of the other apostles is going to go to India and then eventually make his way all the way to what we would call the British Isles, okay? Now, there's another legend that says that Joseph of Arimathea, you guys remember who that is? He's the guy who takes Jesus's body off the cross and said, hey, I want to bury Jesus in my own tomb. That guy. The legend says that Joseph of Arimathea, basically after the story in the book of Acts, Joseph of Arimathea is going to make his way to the British Isles and start to share the gospel. In fact, there's even a legend that says that when Jesus is a child, his father and some of the other family members make their way all the way to the British Isles. Whether or not that happened, I don't know. But we know one of the apostles makes his way to the British Isles. And Joseph of Arimathea, whether he did or not, I don't know. But the Eastern Church accepts it as something that's true, especially the Oriental Eastern churches and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so the Church of England, especially Northern England, okay, it was small, but they've been there at least since the 2nd century, okay, if not the end of the 1st century. So the Church of England has been around just as long as the Church of Rome and Jerusalem, maybe not the 1st century, but definitely the 2nd century. So in Northern England, if you know your geography, what am I talking about when I describe Northern England?
The UK.
Huh?
Like the UK.
Well, the UK is not Northern England, Scotland. Okay, I mean, it is part of the UK, yes, but the UK is more than just that. So when this happens, Christianity remained very small in northern British Islands. Okay, and back when Rome still existed, the entire islands, all of these were called Britannia. Okay, so it was a Roman Latin term, and so eventually that part of the world became known as Scotland. But the Scots and the Irish, okay, they both originally kind of came from the same place. We think of them as the ancient Celts. Okay, Celts. So think of, you know, the Celtic people, right? So the Celtic pagan religion is the religion of that northern spot. So Christianity in that part of the world was always very small up until the medieval era kicks off, right? And we know that around 500, the Pope sends a guy named Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, okay, different generation here. In the 500, he sends Augustine of what we call Augustine of Canterbury. The Pope sends Augustine from Rome to be a missionary to the people of Britannia that they've heard about. And when he gets there, they don't understand that Christianity has already been in existence in a small little pocket in northern British Isles, right? What we think of as Scotland today. The lower parts of England and the southern parts of Scotland. He doesn't realize that there's been small tribes that have had Christianity there for a long time. They just know it's Celtic. They recognize the ancient pagan part of it. So the Pope sends Augustine. Augustine shows up. He introduces himself to the King of Kent, K-E-N-T, the King of Kent. I think I have that right. And he is given, his wife actually is a Christian. And so she's like, hey, you really need to listen, because she's from another country. You really need to listen to this Augustine. So the king listens, and eventually he converts, and he gives him what we call a cathedral, basically gives him a head church in what we know today as Canterbury. Okay, and so Augustine of Canterbury is considered the first Archbishop of England, or specifically Canterbury. Okay, so I'm taking you all the way back to like the 500s in that story, right? But the reason why I'm doing that is because of all we're going to talk about here. So there's been a church here at least since 500s, according to the Roman Catholics. But other scholars, and especially the Orthodox Church, would tell you, well, Christianity has been in England at least since the 2nd century, if not the end of the 1st century. So, any questions about that? Yeah.
So what year was that?
When so Augustine, let's see. Augustine is sent to England. Let's see here. Um, 595. I'm answering your question.
595?
Yes. Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustine to England as a missionary in 595. The guy that I was talking about, the King of Kent, if you're interested in this, his name is really hard to pronounce, let alone right, is King Ethelbert? Because this is really old English. If not almost Germanic. And yes, that's a capital E because that's how they did it. So it's a capital A, capital E, Tholbolt, that Thurbert. So anyway, so Christianity gets its foothold, according to Roman Catholic history, for the most part, in 595. In fact, because of his success, the Pope sends even more missionaries in 601. However, like I said, other traditions in the church believe that there had been a church there at least since the 2nd century, if not the end of the 1st. So Kramner said, hey, listen, we've been a church. We know what we're doing, okay? And that's why I brought all that up. Listen, there's been a church in England as long as there's been a church in Rome, if not. If it's not 595, then even before that. And so Henry hears about what Cranmer's saying at Cambridge University. And Henry calls him and he says, all right, hey, listen, in October of 1529, in October of 1529, Henry is informed of Cranmer, and Cranmer, he calls him, King orders Cranmer to come and to live in the family home of Anne Boleyn. Okay, A-N-N-E. Okay. Sometimes the E is dropped off on the end there, or wait, no, I spelled that wrong. B-O-L-E-Y. There we go. So he's like, hey, this is my future wife. I want you to go be her chaplain. So Cranmer gets a cushy job as chaplain to the future wife of the king. Now, wait a minute. Isn't he married to Catherine? Yep. Okay. So the king has already started a relationship with another woman, Anne, while being married to Catherine of Aragon. Okay. Kind of in secret. For some people, they don't recognize this. And Cranmer goes and he starts to serve as her chaplain. Now, Cranmer starts to write a brief of sorts, an argument. Some people would call this a legal document, but he writes an essay to convince other scholars that the marriage to Catherine was unlawful in the eyes of God, as according to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, a man could not marry his brother's wife. And Henry's like, that's a great argument, Cranmer. Thank you. I'll use that. His opinion is going to be shared with the rest of Cambridge in February of 1530. Okay. In fact, now I'm kind of painting a picture here of Henry, but you have to understand, Henry is doing this for very political purposes, but he's a very stout Roman Catholic. He genuinely believes that he has sinned against God by marrying his brother's wife. Okay, he's like, well, this has to explain why Catherine is not producing a male heir because of my sin. So Cranmer gives him a theological explanation for this. Oh, okay, got it. So the rest of Cambridge, basically, the Cambridge scholars agree with Cranmer in February 1530. In January of 1532, Cranmer is sent to attend the coronation of Charles V in Bologna. I don't know if it's pronounced Bologna like we pronounce Bologna, but it's in what we call, I think it's in Germany. But anyway, so he goes to kind of serve as an ambassador for the king. While while in his journey, he visits Nuremberg. And Cranmer met Andreas Osiander. And Osiander is a Lutheran reformer pastor. And Cranmer meets Osiander's niece and takes her as his second wife, because remember his first wife died giving birth. And her name was Marguerite. And so Marguerite, for all practical purposes, she's kept secret because even upon their return to England, because he's not supposed to remarry, okay? Because again, they're Roman Catholics. And this is very medieval, and she's a reformer, and her uncles are very famous Lutheran Protestant reformer, and Henry's still in a relationship with the Roman Catholics at this point. So his marriage is kind of kept secret. And so by April, while he's out serving as kind of this ambassador of sorts for King Henry VIII, he winds up meeting the Pope. And he is installed by the Pope as England's penitentiary in Rome. So this is kind of a person that's they're basically officially representing the English monarch to the Church of Rome, and going back and helping the king repent of their sins and so on and so forth. So while he's in Italy, it was Cranmer's job to convince the other universities of the world, especially the ones in Rome, that Henry's marriage to Catherine is unlawful. And of course, the Pope says, you cannot do that. I already told you guys, I need the marriage to last. I can't take off Charles V. So the Pope initially forbids him from going to the universities and having these discussions, but all the academics kind of rise up a little bit, and the Pope's like, all right, fine, you can debate it, but that's all this is going to be, is an academic debate, right? This is not going to happen. So by April, Cranmer, he gets all this done. He eventually, in October, he returns to England. And Cranmer, again, goes back to serving as Anne Boleyn's chaplain, and eventually he's made the king's chaplain. And so in August of 1532, King Henry appoints Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, so Cranmer becomes the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Remember, bishops are bishops over regions of the world, right? Or different regions within their countries. And then you have an archbishop who oversees all of them. Does that make sense? In England, there are two archbishops. The first one is in Canterbury. Anybody know where the second one is? One of our, think about it. You guys don't know British history, that's okay. York. It's where we get New York from. Okay. So, Cranmer is going to delay his response as his appointment. He for 7 weeks, hoping that Henry is going to change his mind. He doesn't necessarily want to do it. But in January 1533, unbeknownst to Cranmer, Henry's got other plans, and he's like, listen, I really need you to become the Archbishop. So Henry secretly marries Anne Boleyn. Okay. His marriage has not been annulled, or his divorce has not been officially decreed yet. So technically, for at least a few days, King Henry is the polygamist in this sense. Okay. And he married her in secret, unbeknownst to Cranmer, because Henry's gotten her pregnant. In February of 1533, the council develops a plan to help gain approval of the divorce. The council is kind of all the religious scholars and bishops and popes, not popes, but of England that kind of all get together. And they suggested Parliament pass a law which would forbid any English ecclesiastical issue to be heard in Rome, but rather that the English ecclesiastical courts would decide that issue. Ecclesiastical meaning church, okay? So it now becomes against the Parliament is going to pass a law that says if there's any church issues within England, it has to be dealt with in England by law. You cannot take it to Rome. In the meantime, Henry blackmails Pope Clement into issuing the bull approving the appointment of Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop, threatening to withhold the annual money that is sent by England to Rome. It's basically withholding the tithe money from the church. Okay. Huh?
Who does that?
Henry does that. Henry blackmails the Pope and says, listen, if you don't approve this, we're not going to send our tithe money. Does that sound like anything, y'all? I mean, y'all don't experience that. But that's my church background and churches that I grew up in, if you got ticked off at the pastor or what the pastor was doing in the church, you would withhold your tithes.
My dad was a pastor, someone did that.
Yeah.
It was a deacon on the board, and my dad made the decision.
Yep.
To get the air conditioning fixed in the church.
Yep.
Midsummer in Kansas, it's like August. And guy
Yep.
comes in his office, and he's like, he threatens to leave the church, and he's like, the biggest tithe in the church.
Yep. So, and think about that. Why is that? Because generally the pastor is paid off of the tithes of the church, right? All right. So this is what Henry does. So this is a very ancient practice of what I'm getting at. We've been doing this for several hundred centuries. So the Pope caves and he gives in and he issues the papal bull acknowledging that Thomas Cranmer is now the Archbishop of Canterbury on March 3rd, 1533. On March 30th, Cranmer is consecrated as Archbishop, although he read a protest in which he declared that he declared no oath to the Pope, because before this, if you were installed as a bishop or an archbishop, hold on, guys. Hey, Father Joseph, I'm giving a lecture. Can I call you back after my lecture? Yes, yeah, thank you. Bye. So on March 30th, he's consecrated as Archbishop. He declares, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to accept this position. And yes, we understand that the Pope is acknowledging this, but I declare no allegiance to the Pope. My allegiance is to the church in England and the king. Okay. And so he did this as a direct order from Henry. Yeah.
So like, I'm not like trying to like bash on these guys or anything, but if they don't want to listen to the Pope, why don't they just go, okay, we're starting our new church.
You're jumping the gun, brother.
Yeah.
I feel like.
Just hold your horse. That's where we're going with this.
Why do you need permission from the Pope? If you're saying, like, he's like, I want your permission to have this position, but I don't have any like authority. You don't have any authority over me, but I want your permission. Like, it's like, come on.
Okay, because you haven't taken church history 1 with us. Those of you who haven't taken church history 1, you don't understand. The church is pretty much united. At this point, there's 2 churches. There's the East and the West. But we've already had 1 church split, and they don't want to repeat that.
Yeah.
Okay. For the first 1,000 years, the first split, the first big major split doesn't happen until 1054, when the Eastern Church splits from the Western Church. Technically, Rome kicks them out, and the Eastern Church is like, whatever. Okay. So unity is a big thing, because we're talking about the church. big C. Okay, you're all raised in local church mentality. If you don't like something, you leave and you go to another local church, which is basically what you just said.
Oh my God.
But what was Jesus's prayer
Sanctified.
his last week, right? He prays for the disciples.
Yeah, sanctified in the church.
He says, Lord, let them be one, as you and I are one. His prayer is for the unity of his followers. And the church has always taken this very seriously, especially who? You Church History 1 folks. Whose job was it to protect the faith?
Bishops.
The bishops.
Bishops.
The bishops are the direct lineage from the apostles. The apostles laid hands on the bishops and ordained them as overseers. And that's where the bishop's authority comes from, right? And so the Pope, originally there were 5. Okay, and Rome is one of those. They were considered the tiebreaker. And so they always started looking to Rome, and that's how the Pope in Rome kind of began to be elevated. Eventually he said, well, I'm the top dog, right? So they're gonna do that.
Yeah.
You've jumped the gun, but they don't want to because it's one united church. Well, technically it's 2 united churches, but still, right? Because we're one body of Christ. And so after they get together and they pass this law and Cranmer becomes Archbishop. 2 days later, Cranmer attends a debate between the upper and lower houses of the convocation, all the clergy, basically. All the clergy in the convocation decide that if Arthur and Catherine had consummated their marriage, then the marriage between Catherine and Henry was unlawful. And Cranmer requests permission from King Henry VIII to sit and provide judgment upon the marriage to Catherine. Basically, the premise was if they had sex, then we can't say that he could remarry legally, okay? Because she's the wife of another person, okay? Even though the husband is dead. At this point in history, you do not remarry, is what I'm getting at, okay? So, but Cranmer says, listen, give me permission to sit and make judgment on this issue. I'll be the head judge for all the ecclesiastical courts. And King's like, heck yeah, let's do this, buddy. So on May 10th, 1533, a court that Cranmer is seating as ultimate judge on opens for debate at Dunstable. Catherine does not come and make an appearance. Well, think about this. She's pretty much being treated as a harlot at this point. She doesn't appear because if she shows up, she's in trouble. If she doesn't show up, she's in trouble. She's basically in trouble no matter what she does. So if she goes to the court and she tries to appeal, okay, to Rome, she's broken English law because they just passed a law that says you can't, if it's a church issue, you can't appeal to Rome. We have to take care of it in England. So if she appeals the court, if she appeals the summons, basically, she's breaking the law, so then she gets in trouble. So she was declared to be willfully disobeying the ecclesial court's authority by not showing up. So all of the opinions and evidence that are gathered from different letters and writings from the university academics and the different bishops and all these people are presented to Cranmer, half of which he organized originally, remember? On May 23rd, Cranmer declared the marriage was unlawful, and both Henry and Catherine were free to remarry whoever they wanted to. Okay. Cranmer validates Henry's secret marriage to Anne 5 days later. Okay. On June 1st, Anne was crowned Queen of England by Cranmer. Anne gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth. Now, his first daughter from Catherine, her name is Mary. The second daughter with Anne is Elizabeth. Okay. Now, Anne gives birth to Elizabeth on September 7th, 1533, and on December 3rd, 1533, Cranmer is officially installed in Canterbury. He was already made Archbishop, but he doesn't make his journey to the because he's doing all the work for the king. in London. He doesn't make it to Canterbury until the end of the year, in December. In early 1534, Parliament rejects and abolishes all papal power in England and vested those powers in the Archbishop of Canterbury, legally. By November of 1534, Henry called for and Parliament enacted a series of laws. That's number one, everybody take notes because this is going to show up on an exam. By November 1534, Henry called for and Parliament enacted a series of laws that, number one, stopped all annual dues, basically tithes, to Rome. You don't tithe to Rome anymore. Number two, all churches affirm that Henry's, all legal and church authorities affirm that Henry's marriage to Catherine had been unlawful. And number three, that the monarch of England was to be, quote, the supreme head of the Church of England, end quote.
Say that last one again.
Number three, that the monarch of England was to be the, quote, supreme head of the Church of England, end quote. So by law, in 1534, Parliament says the head of the church is the King of England.
You said November 15.
Yes, 1534, not 54, 34, 1534. So in England, by law now, the monarch, are you guys understanding what just happened?
King of England.
Yeah, Jesus is the head of the church.
Dang.
Well, he is,
Not according to this law, that's the supreme head of the church.
he's the temporal head of the church.
Nobody else on.
In their understanding, this is not the godly kingdom head. This is the head of the church on earth. Specifically for England is the point here.
Based on this guy's behavior, I don't think he's thinking about Jesus a whole lot.
Essentially, they just left the Roman Church, right? Or they just left the Holy Roman Empire.
Pretty much. But he does it for legal reasons, not just theological reasons. Okay. So he's still kind of very Roman Catholic in his doctrine. He's just
I feel like he thinks he's Roman Catholic. Because he's like, it's like he married the first wife and he really thought he married her, but then when it wasn't convenient for him, then he was like, oh, but now I'm not married.
now this law, you need to write this down. In 1534, it's called the Act of Supremacy. It is an English law that is still in effect to this day.
Dang, boy.
Queen Elizabeth II right now is the head of the Church of England.
Wow.
Okay. And when she dies and Prince Charles, when Prince Charles becomes king, Charles will be the head of the church.
Wow.
But right now it's Elizabeth II. Okay. Now listen, you guys are judging them, but you are so far removed from the medieval era. You don't understand their mindset about all this. They have this idea of a divine right of kings, that God is the one who puts the king in power. You're Americans. You don't think about that. Not only that, you're millennials. And so you really don't like people telling you that, there's a kind of an ultimate authority figure. But that's the way the medieval era, that's the medieval church. That's how they thought. That's how the world operated.
Roman Catholicism and Christ. Technically, my step-grandfather, my grandfather was Roman Catholic, and he divorced his wife. She had an affair on him, so by many people's biblical standards, marriage was over. But until she died, he couldn't technically remarry my biological grandmother because the marriage wasn't over by the Roman Catholic standards.
Right. You say that's Roman Catholicism, but that's American Protestant evangelicalism too. In the IPHC and in the Assemblies of God, it was against the rules to remarry.
Really?
The famous longest serving IPHC bishop. Anybody want to know take a guess who that is for you IPHC folks?
You said longest.
The longest serving IPHC bishop. No,
Like, are you saying like general superintendent, like?
what you guys know as general superintendent, the official term though is presiding bishop. He was the longest serving presiding bishop of the IPHC. The current one is Doug Beecham, so it ain't him. And I'm talking about him in the past tense, so he's dead.
Yeah.
His name is J.H. King, Joseph H. King. Y'all need to learn your IPHC history, y'all. All right.
Wait up, that you gotta cancel, you gotta talk to BPA.
Oh.
Come off.
All right. So Joseph H. King, he had a second wife, Blanche. And Blanche King she was one of the first major leaders of the women's auxiliary for the IPHC. However, according to the rules and kind of the understood norms of even the IPHC doctrine at the time, he could not marry Blanche until his first wife died. So don't poke fun at the Roman Catholics. This was a Christian belief all the way up to the King died in the 1550s. And so if I remember my history right, he married Blanche in the 20s. And the thing was, he was an old fart and she was like in her 20s.
Bro.
I don't mean any disrespect. I'm just trying to say, King was not a young man when he married Blanche.
Dust coming out.
Blanche was a young woman. She was, if I remember right, she was in her 20s and he was approaching 50.
Oh, yikes.
His first wife, I think had divorced him, had left, if I remember right. And until she died, he could not remarry,
Dang.
which is basically what he was saying about Roman Catholics, which is what we're getting at. And I'm telling you, that's not just a Roman Catholic thing. I grew up in the Assemblies of God, and that was kind of a rule in the AG. And the IPHC practiced it because the presiding bishop of the IPHC couldn't marry his second wife until his first wife had died.
So that's why Henry.
Is there like what's the scripture? I mean, I'm sure there is a scripture.
Maybe
Like, that.
there's scripture on that.
Well, we've already talked about this, the main part being Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And then there's which is what the Pharisees and the Sadducees are getting to when they go to Jesus and they had that whole debate of, when a man's, when you get to heaven, that kind of thing. Yeah. So you guys have got me on a side journey and I got 10 minutes left, dang it. All right. So Queen Anne in January 1536, now that Catherine's off the hook and she's gone and now Anne is the queen, she gives birth to a stillborn child. This is her second child. The first one was Elizabeth, right? Unfortunately, Henry's patience wore thin quite quickly, and he immediately becomes attracted to another woman named Jane Seymour. Because listen, his second wife has not given him a male heir, dadgummit.
Wondering eyes. Woman's fault.
Yeah. This isn't the temporary history where it takes the longest one. Nothing's responsible.
Matthew.
Now on Wednesday, because we're not going to get through all this today, obviously, but Wednesday when we pick back up, remind me what you just said, because because Anne and Catherine, especially Anne, they have a very unique role to play in the preservation of scriptures within English history. One of the oldest Bibles that we have from this period of time came from Anne, and it's because she hid it and kept it within her family for years after this whole thing happened. So anyway, she can't, her first kid's a daughter, her second kid died, the boy, it's a boy, but dies stillbirth. So Henry immediately starts to come up and conspire to replace her with Jane, his third lover. Now, it was quite auspicious then when on May 2nd, Anne is arrested, charged with adultery. Not only adultery, but incest, committing adultery with her brother and two other men. And she's sentenced to the Tower of London. Those are obviously trumped up charges, y'all.
Yeah.
She didn't really do that.
I watched the movie, but I watched the Boiling Sisters or whatever.
Yeah.
And this all.
On May 3rd,
I've seen that one.
On May 3rd, Cranmer writes a letter appealing to King Henry VIII on Anne's behalf. And he's like, just think about Cranmer here, okay? He's like, what the crap is going on? I mean, I just got you out of the whole thing with Catherine. Now you're leaving Anne, and you've already started this thing with Jane, and you're accusing Anne of doing this. She didn't do this. What's going on? But he can't upset the king because the king's just going to him, right? So Cranmer writes a letter appealing to King Henry on Anne's behalf, but it did not win her a pardon. Cranmer was granted the responsibility to be her confessor, so basically go be her chaplain and hear her sins before she was to be killed, which he fulfilled on May 18th. Again, we're in 1536. The next day, after he hears her confession on May 18th, May 19th, Anne is executed. The one that got her head chopped off that you were asking about earlier.
And so, because of their rule of you can't marry until they're dead, that's why he got her killed.
Among other things, but yes.
So what's,
Okay, so biologically speaking, he really could have had a male child with any of these women,
yeah.
but because I get that science wasn't where it is now then, so this isn't an understanding.
You guys understand?
The male,
Yeah.
but realistically speaking, he could have just continued trying to have children with one of the women
Well,
and ended up with a male, right?
sometimes,
That kid would be an heir though. It would be like a.
Okay, so it has to be a firstborn male?
No, no. It has to, but here's the thing, and I'm not a genetics and I'm not into biology, but the male
Yeah, the male's responsible.
the male has a lot to do with whether or not the child comes out male or female.
He is the issue. It's always been him. It's always been his fault. I stand on that thing.
The girls
Yeah.
do the-
I think
She had a boy, but
I
he
think
stressed her
Ramsey
out
was
every time we
on
did.
Okay, all right. So let's get to a good stopping point because we're going to pick up on Wednesday and continue with this. So Cranmer goes and hears her confession. The next day on May 19th, 1536, she's executed. Anne is executed. Cranmer is truly heartbroken by this. And when he wakes up that morning, he had a visiting Scottish reformer named Alex Aless, Aless, who had been staying, who was visiting him. Remember, he's Archbishop of Canterbury. He's an academic from Cambridge. He'd already been reading Luther. And Cranmer had basically introduced Lutheran writings to the king, King Henry. And Henry starts to embracing some Protestant ideas. He always remains Roman Catholic, though. He just starts to accept some of these Protestant ideas as a way to solve his legal issues, right, with his marriage. But Cranmer starts to read more and more, and he starts to make more friends in the Protestant Reformation. Alex is one of them. So Alex is there, had been spending the night, and when he wakes up, the Scottish reformer Alexander Aless, who did not know of what was going on, he didn't know of all this legal issues and Anne and all this kind of stuff. She had been executed. Comes out and met with Cranmer in his garden. And Cranmer was lamenting and cried, "Do you not know what's to happen today?" The morning that she's executed. She who has been the Queen of England upon the earth will today become a queen in heaven. Later that day, Cranmer granted a special dispensation allowing Henry to marry Jane Seymour because his wife had just died. Right? So this is the point. Jane finally gives birth to a male son. And if you're
So just treating this like it's a show.
and the boy's name is Edward VI. And we'll pick up on Wednesday and talk about what happens under Edward after Henry dies and Thomas Cranmer and Edward. Things are going to just get a lot more interesting after this.
Spicy.
It's really spicy with Henry, but church related stuff. the church related stuff is gonna get even more interesting on Wednesday.
And I just made a joke about this feeling like a CW show. It really does. It feels like season 8 or 9 of a CW show where things are just totally out of hand. and everything's going around.
It's like you don't want to root for Henry because you know he's a bad dude, but he makes the show so interesting.
Mind you, hey, mind you, this is the English Reformation. Okay, this is how the English church is reformed. We'll pick up there on Wednesday, so remind me where we left off.